When you walk through Riga today, you will see a lot of Latvian flags, among others. But imagine that you would walk through these streets and all the flags you saw were red, red, red during the times of the Latvian Socialist Soviet Republic. And when I say that, you probably will think about Latvia under communist rule as part of the USSR after the Second World War. But did you know that there existed a very short-lived Latvian Socialist Soviet Republic from 1918 till 1920? This here was a short-lived communist state. In this video, we're going to talk about that. The nation of Latvia emerged from the former Imperial Russian provinces of Courland and Livonia. The westernmost part, Courland, had been annexed by Russia in 1795 after the third partition of Poland. It was ruled by Baltic German nobles and populated mainly by Latvian-speaking Lutheran peasants. The easternmost region, Latgale, joined Russia earlier in 1772 during the first Polish partition. Latgale had a large Jewish population and also included Polish and Belarusian minorities. During World War I, the Latvian territories experienced intense fighting. Russia's 1914 invasion of East Prussia was launched from this area, and many Latvian soldiers served under Russian General Rennenkampf, whose forces were defeated at the Battle of the Masurian Lakes. By the summer of 1915, the German army had occupied all of Courland and half of Livonia. As they withdrew, the Russians evacuated Riga's industries and forced out much of the city's Jewish and Latvian population, reducing Riga's population by half. The idea of Latvian statehood had already been raised in 1905, when Latvian deputies in the Russian Duma called for an autonomous administration combining Livonia, Courland, and parts of Vitebsk. But by February 1917, much of this territory was under German occupation. The Russian provisional government, uncertain about national borders and its own power, refused to grant autonomy. In Riga, which remained in Russian hands, political rivalries erupted after the February Revolution. Bolsheviks dominated the Soviets, the councils, while moderate socialists and civic leaders competed for influence in the city Duma. The Bolsheviks focused heavily on winning over soldiers, particularly the Latvian riflemen. The Latvian riflemen were a military formation of the Imperial Russian Army assembled in Latvia during World War I in order to defend the Baltic governorates against the German Empire. They were used as an elite force. By May 1917, they had gained strong control over the riflemen's Soviet, and by September, just before the Germans captured Riga, the Bolsheviks effectively controlled the city's institutions through legal elections. In September, the Germans captured Riga. After the Bolshevik Revolution in October 1917, the power struggle in Latvia intensified. The Latvian Social Democrats formed their own Soviet of Soviets, Iskolat, which declared itself the government of unoccupied Latvia. Meanwhile, a Latvian National Council demanded autonomy and self-determination in line with Bolshevik principles. A separate democratic bloc also pushed for a unified Latvian state. In March 1918, Germany and Soviet Russia signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, in which the Germans gained large parts of Russia, including all of Latvia, restoring power to the Baltic German nobility and planning to create a duchy under German control. In November 1918, things radically changed again. After Germany's defeat in November 1918, the Latvian National Council declared Latvia's independence, forming a provisional government led by Kārlis Ulmanis. However, the German army under General Rüdiger von der Goltz remained in Latvia on orders from the Inter-Allied Commission, and the British, though hostile to Bolshevism, refused to intervene militarily. They instead encouraged the Latvians to rely on German troops for defense. Bolshevik leader Lenin wasted no time in advancing revolution in the newly conquered lands. His decision to sign the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk and thus to focus on the survival of socialism in Russia had been forced upon him by the military advances of the Central Powers. Now that Germany and her allies had been defeated, he could return to pursuing his ultimate objective of igniting a global Bolshevik revolution. The Bolsheviks sponsored Latvian and Lithuanian Soviet republics and their much smaller Estonian equivalent, the Commune of the Working People with the headquarters in the city of Narva, swiftly began to introduce radical reforms, including the expropriation and nationalization of property and land in the hands of the middle classes, while suppressing resistance from the starving population with brute force. In December 1918, the Red Army invaded and proclaimed the Latvian Socialist Soviet Republic, led by Pēteris Šučka, a Latvian Bolshevik. On January 3, 1919, Riga fell to the Reds, and Ulmanis' government fled to Liepāja on the coast. The Latvian riflemen, influenced by Bolshevik propaganda, supported the new regime, which imposed harsh revolutionary policies, severe food shortages, forced requisitions, and state control over trade worsened living conditions. Hunger, executions, and persecution of so-called class enemies, often ethnic Germans, created widespread misery. The future US President Herbert Hoover, then in charge of the American Relief Administration, helping war victims in Eastern Europe, described conditions in Bolshevik-controlled Riga from January to May 1919. Common criminals, as well as political zealots, were running amok, he reported, looting stores and dwellings, shooting hundreds of innocent people every day, while many inhabitants were dying of starvation. Hoover's anti-communist fervor may have colored his terms, but conditions in Riga were truly appalling. In the 5 months of Soviet occupation, over 3,000 executions were carried out in the city and surrounding villages. 8,000 people died of starvation, and another 10,000 were confined to concentration camps. Under Pēteris Šučka, the Latvian Socialist Soviet Republic (LSPR) introduced sweeping communist reforms, continuing the radical direction of the earlier Iskolat government. Some early measures, such as seizing property from the wealthy, were welcomed by parts of the population. However, the nationalization of all farmland caused major problems. Rural support collapsed and food supplies to the cities dwindled. As peasants refused to deliver food on government terms, urban starvation worsened. Growing unrest among both workers and peasants led the regime to launch a brutal Red Terror targeting supposed counter-revolutionaries. Revolutionary tribunals and armed female enforcers, known as Flintenweiber, gunwomen, became infamous symbols of this violence. Meanwhile, in Liepāja, von der Goltz organized two pro-German forces, the Iron Division, Freikorps volunteers, and the Baltic Landeswehr, officially under Latvian command but controlled by Baltic German officers like Major Alfred Fletcher. These forces operated independently of Ulmanis' government. By March 1919, they had taken the Latvian coast and the city of Jelgava. However, on April 16, 1919, they overthrew Ulmanis' government in a coup. The British, though disapproving, still did not intervene. Seeking to retake Riga, von der Goltz asked Berlin for permission. President Friedrich Ebert, wary of angering the Allies, refused official authorization, but told von der Goltz he could use the independent Landeswehr. On May 22, 1919, German and Freikorps forces captured Riga, killing hundreds or even thousands of Latvians in the process. White Terror replaced the earlier Red Terror with mass executions of suspected Bolsheviks. In June 1919, a joint Latvian-Estonian army defeated the Iron Division at the Battle of Cessus. Shortly afterwards, the Treaty of Riga was signed, and a British military mission arrived in Latvia. The Latvian government returned, and the Allies took control of the Landeswehr. Under pressure, Ebert dismissed von der Goltz on August 5th. But the general continued plotting. Von der Goltz supported General Bermont Avalov, a Russian adventurer who created the so-called Russian Army of the West, also known as the Bermontians. In reality, a cover for German troops. In October 1919, his forces attacked Riga, but were defeated thanks to Latvian mobilization, Estonian equipment, and Allied naval support. By January 1920, Latvian and Polish forces controlled the border region, and a ceasefire with Soviet Russia followed. After negotiations, the Latvian Socialist Soviet Republic was officially dissolved. Finally, the Treaty of Riga, August 11, 1920, formally ended the conflict. Soviet Russia recognized Latvia's independence, defined its borders, and agreed to return prisoners, property, and pay reparations.